Organized crime and violent extremism in the Western Balkans is the next panel. Far-right extremists, often driven by national sentiments, have deep ties to politicians and officials, forming quasi-private militias that undermine governance and fuel criminal networks. What role does political instability in the Balkans play in empowering them? On many questions that arises from these ties, for answers we'll be looking Adrian Shtuni, Foreign Policy and Security Specialist, Giorgio Fruscione, Research Fellow, Italian Institute for International Political Studies, Jovana Škorić, Assistant Professor, Faculty of Philosophy, University of Novi Sad, Ruggero Scaturro, Senior Analyst, Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, and moderating this panel will be by Fatjona Mejdini, Director of the Southeastern Europe Observatory Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime.
We are also pleased to announce a parallel panel discussion titled Navigating Challenges, How Bilateral Disputes Influence Domestic Reforms in North Macedonia's EU Journey. The panelists are Malinka Ristiska-Jordanova, European Policy Institute Skopje, Jana Faktor-Juzova, Research Fellow in Europeum, Institute for European Policy, and Marko Trosanovski, President of the Institute for Democracy, Societas Civilis from Skopje. The panel will be moderated by Katarina Sinadinovska, co-founder of the Balkan Center for Constructive Policies Solution. It will be held in the room 14. Enjoy the panels.
I believe we can start, yes. Good day, everyone. It's truly a pleasure to moderate this panel today on the nexus between violent extremism and organized crime in the Western Balkans. But more importantly, it's a real privilege for us, the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, to collaborate and to co-host this panel with Belgrade Security Conference. This partnership, in fact, has made it possible to discuss some of the most sensitive issues in the region within a safe and open environment. So thank you very much, Belgrade Security Conference, for this opportunity. With the support of the Dutch government, the Global Initiative has been analyzing the intersection between extremism and crime in the Western Balkan region. Today, our panelists will share with us some of the key findings of their efforts, but on the other hand, they also will give us a broader overview on the current state of this phenomena and discuss what can be done to better address these challenges in the future. Without further ado, I would like to kick off the discussion with Mr. Adrian Shtuni. Adrian, my question to you is going to be why it's important to really investigate this link, and the most important thing is what we need to have in consideration when doing so.
Right, so it's a very important question. First and foremost, thank you to the organizers for putting together such an amazing conference, and thanks to Global Initiative for inviting me personally to be here on this panel. Why is it important? Well, the organized crime terror nexus is a growing global security threat, and without having a broader, comprehensive understanding of the nexus between the one and the other, we're not going to be effective at fighting both of them. Basically, in order for us to build effective policies and prevention mechanisms and adequate responses, we need to understand how each of these threats operates and how they coordinate with one another and how do they achieve what they achieve on the ground. A significant portion of terrorist organizations resort to organized crime for funding their operations and also for logistical purposes. Because they need weapons, they need forged documents to operate. So they have to resort not only to smuggling of drugs and smuggling of weapons or other elements of organized crime to fund their operations, but also because there is no other way for them to procure the weapons, and so they have to resort to organized crime. They have to work with organized crime entities together. We've seen a number of cases. All terrorist organizations resort one way or another to this kind of practices. You can go back to IRA, you can go back to ETA, you can go to Le Brigate Rosse, the Red Brigades, and you can come back to ISIS if you want, right? So they, for example, would steal artifacts in Iraq, and they had to sell them to make money, to fund their operations. So how would they sell those artifacts? They would resort to organized crime. Same thing with oil. They would have to resort to organized crime to sell the oil, so that proceeds would then go to fund their activities. In some cases, there is organizations that actually operate as organized crime groups, although they are terrorist organizations. So Hamas, for example, it does both. It is fully entrenched in organized crime and selling drugs and so on. And the nature of the nexus and the strength of the nexus will depend on the settings, the local settings, wherever they operate. But both these organizations, be that organized crime and terrorist organizations, they thrive wherever there is socio-political instability, lack of good governance, economic issues or deprivation, intolerance, and especially corruption. So we've had a lot of cases over the years when we've seen criminals transition to terrorist activities. I can mention the Paris attacks. I can mention in 2015. I can mention other cases in the Nice terrorist attacks, Berlin Christmas market terrorist attacks. You had individuals involved in crime then transitioned to carrying out terrorist attacks. And it's interesting because there is a nexus to the Balkans, because all the weapons that have been used in these terrorist attacks that I mentioned originate from the Western Balkans. And they found their way in the European black market through exactly organized crime networks. Same thing when it comes to the terrorist attack in Vienna in 2020, very recently, when you had an individual who was a dual citizen of Austria and one of the countries in the Western Balkans, who actually procured the weapons that originated from the Balkans through another person who actually, again, was from the region, a former Yugoslav country. So there is the other thing that I'll quickly mention. When it comes to the Balkans, we're having two things happening at the same time. We've had an increase in the number of individuals who've been radicalized, recruited and mobilized in terrorist activities. And we've seen this with the flow of foreign fighters to Syria and Iraq in the past decade. And we've also had an increase, let's say an increase in the volume of involvement of individuals from the Western Balkans in the global drug market. Both of these phenomena are unprecedented. So when you have this kind of growth in both organized crime and terrorist activities, you have to wonder about the overlap. And you have to wonder to what extent there is an overlap between these two global threats. What should we consider? You have to understand one thing, that the very existence of both types of organizations, be them organized crime and terrorist organizations, depends on them morphing, constantly changing, constantly adapting to changing circumstances on the ground. Therefore, when you're doing research and investigating how they operate and how they coordinate, you have to keep that in mind and do this research, do this investigation continuously, not just intermittently. You do it once and you think you understand. Because their very existence exactly depends on them being able to change constantly. This is why even the research has to be constant. And we need to track what they're doing constantly. Then the research and the investigation needs to feed into policy. If we're just doing research for the sake of research, that's not going to be very helpful. But the policies need to reflect these findings from the research. And we shouldn't only focus on, which we actually do all the time, the symptoms. We need to figure out what root causes are causing both an increase in organized crime and an increase in terrorist activities. And look also at the nexus with political power, because sometimes, and I'll mention here the case of Banjska, the attack in northern Kosovo. You have individuals known to have been involved in organized crime, vested with political power, who get engaged and involved in political violence that not only can risk destabilizing one country, in this case Kosovo, but can throw the whole entire region into turmoil. This is why it's critical to investigate not only these issues separately, like organized crime and terrorism, but understand the nexus, especially the connection to also political components.
Yeah. We're, in fact, going to discuss a little bit later on about that. But thank you very much for your remark. It's in fact important to have it as a continuous work, like seeing the nexus and not only violent extremism and organized crime separately. Ruggero Scaturro, in fact, is a senior analyst at the Global Initiative, and in the last few years, he has analyzed this nexus in the region, and quite soon, in fact, it's going also to publish a report about that. Ruggero, how you have seen this nexus manifest in this region?
So thank you very much, first of all, for having me here. It's been definitely an interesting journey, I have to say. And I believe that probably, in all modesty though, what I believe is relatively important, so I'd say that the way I see also the research that we have conducted, so the value added to our research, is that it's definitely one of the few, if not the first, but it's definitely one of the few attempts to understand this phenomenon, so how the nexus manifests, through the lenses of organized crime. We are an organization that deals, that's even in its title, the focus of transnational organized crime. So for us, what was important was to understand how the nexus manifesto, the connection, the interconnections between violent extremism on the one side and organized crime on the other side. So far, at the time of collecting all the research and all the pieces together in order to have an understanding of what's been already written, how it's been already discussed, immediately, I would say the first thought was, well, there is a lot here already been written. There is a lot of narrative. There is a lot of discussion, policy papers, academia as well, often engaging in such topics. But what we saw is that while on the one side there is a lot being discussed and written on the nexus between violent extremism, radicalization, so be it political or religious, and terrorism, especially its financing part, very little, I would say, is being done when it comes to organized crime, the way at least we understand it at the GI, which is pretty much, although of course the definition of organized crime is a little bit, there is no universal definition of organized crime, it really depends on the national jurisdictions, but at least using the definition of the Palermo Protocol, so the UNTOC, the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. So based on this, a few points. So first of all, definitely one point which is particularly interesting is the diversity of the motivations to join. So what brings certain people, certain groups to interconnect and to join forces? As a rule of the thumb, I would say that, of course, and this is, I would say, a very basic understanding, you have organized crime groups, be it mafia-style, loose networks, criminal networks, that, of course, seek partnership in order to boost profits. This is the general understanding, and Adrian actually was talking about it. On the other side, instead, you have violent extremist groups which seek destabilization to boost and to forward their political or religious agenda. And based on this motivation, but of course you have this thumb rule, but then the reality is much different. You have different motivations that often blur, and there's many overlaps. And based on these overlaps and based on the complexity also of the reality, we came up with our own understanding. We came across very short-term transactional objective short-term oriented partnerships, all the way to very strong and quite long-standing partnerships in which actually even organizational boundaries are often blurred. So you have basically, we ask ourselves many times, is this a violent extremist group or is it an organized crime group the way we understand and the way we study them in our work, in our daily job? So it is very important in the context of this analysis to understand the spectrum of these cooperations, based on key indicators that we had to come up with in our own methodology, in our own way to understanding the phenomenon. So one key indicator definitely that we took into consideration is the duration of this partnership. So for how long these groups partner. Then the extent of the resource sharing. How much are they investing in this partnership? Is it just, again, for a specific, I don't know, bombing of the car of a judge or a prosecutor, or is it for long-term agendas? Then also important from a quantitative perspective is how big the phenomenon is. How many people are we talking about? Is it just a few people? Is it one specific imam that operates, for example, outside the Islamic community that radicalizes people and for a specific objective? Or is actually the other way around. So is more people, 50 people, 60 people gathering like-minded people for specific crimes which are perpetrated over time. And then also important to factor in, again, the criminological element. What kind of organized crime are we talking about? What kind of criminal markets are we talking about? It's important, again, to be specific. Is it drug trafficking? Is it extortion? Is it money laundering? Is it arms trafficking? We had the possibility to come across a number of different criminal markets in that sense. This is also, in a way, connected to the next point, which is it is important for us to avoid generalization and proceed case by case. This also, in order to avoid the general mistake in understanding the phenomenon, meaning we assume, I would say as a tendency, a general tendency, to understand these partnerships of the nexus as a positive collaboration. There's always something that is at stake, so that's something they can benefit from. But, however, I have to say that in many areas of the Western Balkans, we've seen also contentious relationship. In many cases, we've observed organized crime groups which actually refrain from partnering with violent extremist groups, depending on the criminal markets in which they operate. In certain criminal markets, partnering or adopting a terrorist agenda, partnering with violent extremist groups, might actually jeopardize the illicit businesses. There are criminal markets which don't require violence, so at least they try to keep the level of violence to the minimum. So we also actually came across this. And also other geographies, and also going back in history, we have seen a lot of criminal organizations, mafia-style organizations, that when they partnered with violent extremist groups, I'm Italian, I can quote, for example, the case of the decline of Cosa Nostra after teaming up with the NAR, which are the Nuclear Armati Rivoluzionari, so a neo-fascist organization in the 70s. For Cosa Nostra, this was a suicide because they attracted law enforcement attention, they make too much noise, up to the point that law enforcement just need to react. There's nothing that you can do. And then to conclude a little bit on the rationale of this study, so why we do this, also going back to what Adrian was saying, it is important to address the fact that for us, this is a relatively important, it's actually very important in terms of societal impacts. We have to address the root causes, especially for recruitment of youngsters. In many cases, youngsters join criminal groups because they see easy money. But when you mix the easy money, which is already an important bait, with ideological purposes, then it's a bomb. Because you have like-minded people that have easy money, and then it's simply too easy to say yes to such groups.
Sure. Sure. Thank you, Ruggero, for sharing with us this nuanced reality, in fact, and how it is different from one country to another and from one criminal market to another as well. In your work, you have been also held by Giorgio Fruscione, which is a researcher with very good knowledge of this region. So, Giorgio, I have said one of the most sensitive and delicate questions for you. Is this nexus sometime having another angle? Is this nexus sometimes turning into a triangle? And with a triangle, I also want to say the fact that how you see this nexus interacting with politics, and not only with political party, but also with the state institution, in fact.
Yes, there are several cases in which these networks have a connection with state institution. And in general terms, we can say that the stronger the tie between a violent extremist group and a state institution, the stronger the position and the power of the same extremist group. And of course, the more dangerous will be their activities. And this is so for many reasons. A good connection can enable potentially limitless access to weapons or military equipment. And if so, you can consequently have also an increase of the level of violence by the group, or, for example, of the territorial control the group exercise. Let's take the example. You have an extremist group that is in cahot with the local police in a certain municipality. It means that potentially they can control that municipality, a certain municipality. And another element witnessing the complicity or connivance between extremist groups and the state institutions is the impunity the groups enjoy sometimes from the judiciary systems. And this happens very often when these groups act as a proxy for state institutions, like, for example, law enforcement agency. And if the state cannot do something out in the open, they may rely on these groups and on their connection with organized crime in order to reach a certain goal. And of course, the perfect environment for such a situation is a captured state. So a state whose institutions are controlled by informal structures or even by ruling party members. And if you have these situations, it means that the state doesn't serve citizens' needs and interests, but rather those of a limited, privileged elite. And there are several ways a connection between an extremist group and a state institution is established. You can have what we call the bad apple from the state institution that is enabling a member of these networks entering the state institution and then to influence it. But what we have found out is that the so-called marriage of convenience is the most often way that this connection is established. So the marriage of convenience implies the two actors agrees not to interfere in the other's business, and that they, let's say, reach an agreement of cooperation over a certain issue. Let's make an example. The state tolerates a drug trade and of a certain organization, and it means that the organization enjoy a certain freedom, controls in an exclusive way a criminal market, over its competitors and, of course, make a profit out of it. And in exchange, they guarantee, for example, they will not make any trouble in public events like, let's say, political rallies, football matches. And this is a win-win situation because they obtain something, they get stronger in their own field, and they don't touch each other. So this is why we call it a marriage of convenience. And in conclusion, the more a state is controlled by informal structures, the more dangerous will be the extremist group acting as a proxy of the state. And when you have this situation, it means that both rule of law and the democratic standards are in real danger.
Thank you. Thank you. In fact, this is a quite complex issue, in fact, and needs a lot of unpacking. But I just want to go back to Ruggero, because you, in fact, mentioned the fact that you mentioned Cosa Nostra and the links that they once had with violent extremists. And of course, you have this overview also for the nexus in how it manifests itself in Europe. But can you tell us what are some of the differences and distinction of this nexus in the Western Balkan region compared with the larger European continent?
Well, let me start by saying that, as actually Adrian also was mentioning in his initial remarks, the nexus between violent extremism and organized crime is not just a Balkan issue. It is a Balkan issue, but it is also an issue in many other geographies. One case in point is definitely, for example, the proliferation of amphetamine-type stimulants such as Captagon in Syria and Iraq under the Islamic State. Another case which is probably more relevant as of now is, for example, the connections between Hezbollah in Latin America and the Tren de Aragua, which is a criminal organization originating from, for example, Venezuela, which is now operating in the Amazon basin. So there are examples pretty much from everywhere. Perhaps, though, one of the manifestations of the nexus, which is particularly relevant for the Balkans and also the wider European continent and beyond as well, is, for example, the nexus between football hooliganism and organized crime. Which I believe you also gonna mention. But anyways, what is important for me is that, again, hooliganism as such, or ultras movement as such, and the penetration of organized crime is definitely a global phenomenon that manifests differently, depending a lot on the local contexts. So as a consequence, understanding from an analytical perspective, and also for policy formulation, understanding the local nuances is critical for effective interventions. Case of Serbia, public secret, everybody knows about the role of specific hooligans groups in Belgrade, in Novi Sad. Hooligans in Serbia control stadiums. Controlling stadiums means also controlling specific groups which are penetrated or even active member of organized crime groups. Controlling the stadiums means controlling a space for recruitment, for profit making, of course. So, and even on top of that, of course, you have hooligans groups which are even used, as Giorgio was saying, as a proxy to advance political agenda. They enjoy specific political protection or by either official political parties or political elites. They act and behave as paramilitary groups oftentimes. This, for example, is something that we've seen in another contexts. We have seen, for example, in the context of the supporters of Spartak Moscow in Russia. And they were actually hooligans really act as paramilitaries, and they really act as, again, proxy for political elites. Other contexts in which the nexus manifests as well, but the context really shapes the way that the nexus manifests. The case of Italy, again, you have in Italy the ultras movement since the 60s and the 70s in cities like Rome particularly, in cities like Milan, where you have ultras movements, ultras groups with a very, very, very strong far-right agenda and identity, neo-fascist groups, as a matter of fact, which have been infiltrated and have been in business with local organized crime groups forever. From the case of Diabolic, which was the ultras of SS Lazio in Rome, which was assassinated for extortion / money laundering schemes. Or the recent one, a couple of weeks ago, where you had the head of the ultras groups supporting Inter Milan stabbing 8 times the son of a very important representative of Clan Bellocco, which is 'Ndrangheta, operating in Milan. So we're talking about serious organized crime here. We're not talking about street gangs. We're talking about well-structured mafia-style groups that have connections in these places. Another case, even further, the case of Argentina is also particularly on point, where you have the Barra Bravas, which is basically the alter ego of ultras and hooligans in Argentina. Supporters of River Plate and Boca Juniors in Buenos Aires, they do have strong political agendas. They even influence the economic and financial operations, and they also have a political say in the matters of the businesses, even of the football club. And then you have, for example, to conclude, the case of England. England has been dealing with hooliganism pretty much throughout the 70s and the 80s, but differently from probably, well, there are, of course, some, connections with organized crime, especially drug trafficking. But what we have seen is that, at least in England, the government has managed to sort of like reduce the problem thanks to a set of reforms and a set of interventions, very directed interventions. But does this mean that the package of reforms that England has implemented in their territory, if implemented in Italy, in Serbia, or in Russia, or in Argentina, will produce the same results? Well, I really doubt it. Because again, hooliganism as such, as associationism of people with a strong political agenda, really differs. So in order to understand and to act in a way that you can really solve the problem, then you really have to understand the local nuances. The phenomenon is global, but it really takes a particular shape when understood in the local context.
Yes, true. There are all sorts of patterns out there, and so they select some of the patterns, they copy them, but of course they need to tailor and customize those based on the realities in the field. Giorgio, I want also to get a little bit to you again, because we were discussing, and Adrian mentioned the fact of arms from this region going to Western Europe and enabling terrorist attacks. And the very fact that we have kind of like the same typology of this nexus in the region, but also abroad. Do we know about collaborations, other forms of collaborations besides armed trafficking and so on?
There is for sure an ideological affinity between extremist groups from the Balkans and those from other parts of Europe. Let's consider the far-right realm first. And because you have several small parties and movements, political organization, or even humanitarian organization that, for example, openly endorse Serbian nationalism, and they share similar ideology. They have the same interpretation of the wars in the 90s. And for example, from our country, from Italy, you have some far-right parties that have established stable relationships with the Serbian far-right organizations and parties, and this was made possible over ideological convergence over the issue of Kosovo. And so they have regular humanitarian missions in Kosovo where they provide assistance in those enclaves where Serbs live, because they consider them as an act of resistance against Western imperialism, against the alleged Islamic penetration of the Balkans and so of Europe. And so they see them as the pillars of Christendom, and as I said, they make a myth out of them. And so here you have like the ideological convergence. But the most important relationship is between religious extremist groups. Since the end of the wars in the Balkans, there have been growing concerns about Islamic terrorism, also due to the high numbers of foreign fighters who joined the so-called Islamic State in Syria or in other war fronts. And but if we look at the statistics at the local level, we see that we have less attacks, less casualties, less, in general, less terroristic activities in the Balkans. Compared to other regions of Europe. But I'm saying so not to underestimate the phenomenon, but in order to contextualize it, as Adrian was explaining at the beginning. This because these extremist religious groups have a specific role within global terrorism. And according to our findings, these local cells of global terrorist organization are providing logistics support, military equipment, and of course foreign fighters for terrorist attacks that are actually occurring elsewhere in Europe or in other regions of the world. And you have many cases, as Adrian said, like the attack in Vienna, the attack in Nice, where you had either people or arms coming from the Balkan region. And so against the backdrop of global terrorism, the Balkans stand as a logistic hub. And even if in the region the phenomenon is less visible, it doesn't mean we can underestimate it. Let's say that this can change in the future, and while they are doing their part of the job within this global phenomenon, this relationship can change in the future. So one can say that we don't have to get stuck in analyzing numbers and statistics, so don't focus on the number of casualties and of terroristic attack, but do keep monitoring the qualitative and the activities of these groups.
No, very, very right. So we should keep monitoring the trends, and this is the most important thing. And we are really looking forward for the upcoming report that we are going to publish together with Ruggero on this nexus in the Western Balkans. We spoke here a little bit about the regional perspective, but on the other hand, we are in Serbia, and not because of that only, but because of the fact that this nexus is, without any doubt, manifest in Serbia. And here, to explain us more, is Miss Jovana Škorić. She is a professor, but at the same time, she's working with civil society. And because of this, Jovana, I want to ask you, how do you see the nexus manifest at the local level? And the most important thing is, how does it impact the citizens, the communities?
Thank you. At the first, I would to thank you for coming here and to have opportunity to talk about this very relevant topic. Today, I will talk from the perspective of someone who comes from the helping professions. So today, I will try to present our field work when it comes to minors and also when it comes to the children with behavior problem and the juvenile offenders. As you said, beside the faculty, I also work in a non-governmental organization which called Restart. An organization actually engaged with different kind of services, user services, in the first place drug addicts, but on the other side we also offer different kind of services to other groups. When we're talking about this problem, today I will try to find the link between the extremism, between the local fan group and between the criminal groups as well. So what do actually we see in the field? There are a lot of children, especially minors and adolescents, are engaged in different kind of criminal activity, mostly related to the fan group, to the hooliganism. And here I have actually two concerns. The first one is how to stop exploitation and how to stop recruitment of the children in those criminal acts. But the other one is related how we can prevent those problems, how we can empower those children, how we can actually educate them to not get into the criminal groups and hooliganism. So I would like to mention our big project, which is in the process right now, supported by Dutch government, as well as the global initiative against transnational organized crime. Through the project, we are actually trying to support children, especially minors, when we're talking about different kind of criminal acts related to the hooliganism. What we try to do, this project consists of the 3 phases. The first phase is about survey. We try to map, we try to find out some risk factors as well as some causes when we're talking about belonging to some extremism group related to the local fan group. The second one is related to the interventions and preventions as well. We are trying to make some more holistic preventions measure when we're talking about adolescents, and we are trying to enter the schools and do some kind of education, do some kind of sessions, workshops. We also create some video material for this research. When the famous sportsmen are talking about bad side and also about some good side of the fan groups, and we are trying to empower them to not get into the different kind of criminal activity related to the fan groups. And what actually is our next phase, it's based on the first and second phase, and we are trying to make some interventions that also include the parents of children. We are trying to make some network, to make some comprehensive actually support to all of children as well as their parents. So I think in this context it's very important to mention also official statistics when we're talking about hooliganism in the Republic of Serbia, especially in the territory of city of Novi Sad. When we're talking about formal statistical data, we have to mention actually Institute for the Social Welfare, and more than 7,000 children are registered as the juvenile offender in the territory of Vojvodina, and more than 3,000 children were registered in the territory of the city of Novi Sad. The highest number of them actually is related to the hooliganism and the criminal group. So I also would like to emphasize that we have to create some safer environment and some environment which maybe is closer to their real needs. When we're talking about children with behavioral problem, I would also like to emphasize that children are not the problem, they have a problem. And I think that we have to be aware of the aspects. And we are talking actually, we are here talking about risk factors. I think that very important to make a difference between risk factors and between causes. So together, I think that we can create more comprehensive system, more holistic system, and help those children to not get into the hooliganism and into the criminal groups.
Yeah. The involvement of children in criminality, in fact, is a very sharp topic across the region and quite problematic. My follow-up question to you is going to be how it is to work with this vulnerable group. Do you face some pushback? And also, have you also got some support from the local government or central government, for that matter?
Yeah. It sometimes can be hard to work with these children, but on the other side, we are here to make things possible. I think it's reachable to make those children to get into the society, but they need support. Non-governmental organization and civil society organization in the Republic of Serbia are positioned very well, I think, and they also are credible professionals. And I think the main maybe benefits from the civil society organization is because they are locally rooted. They really have maybe deeper insight about these local problems when we're talking about hooliganism and extremism. So as non-governmental organization have a big contribution to make these children actually more aware about different kind of risk. But on the other side, we also have struggling with some financial resource, some human resource, professional resource. But I would like to emphasize also that the non-governmental organization in Serbia has positive impact when we're talking about different marginalized group. They offer a big spectrum of programs. We can talk about prevention program as some kind of youth programs, for example, some education stuff, some sessions, some workshops for adolescents and minors, but also they are very close related to some institution. I think without institution we cannot go further, and I think it's very important to emphasize collaboration with different kind of institutions. So I also would like to emphasize that non-governmental organization in the Republic of Serbia, especially when we're talking about context of Novi Sad, are involved in different kind of policy making. They are advocate some better regulation related to the children. They also pay attention on some stricter rules, for example, when we're talking about criminals group and about extremism. So on the end, I would like to emphasize that we have resource to doing things, but on the other side we have maybe a bigger support of the public sector as well as private sector, yes, of course. So I would like on the end to emphasize that united we can go further. We can maybe make some environment for our children and make them more powerful when we're talking about engagement in some positive and democratic activity, not belonging to some hooliganism groups or something like that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jovana, for sharing your insights from the local level. And I think that to tackle both violent extremism and organized crime and the nexus between them at the local level, it's important as it is in the national level, and we spoke about that. But we need also to understand that these phenomena, they are transnational. So international and regional, and then international cooperation is quite important. So I'm just going to ask you, Adrian, about what it can be done, not only to cooperate at the regional level, but how to make it sustainable.
Sure. I mean, it's a very good point, and it's a critical point to understand because organized crime and violent extremism, they don't recognize political borders. These are transnational phenomena, and therefore they need a transnational approach to tackle them, to counter them. So we need to work towards common solutions. We need to have common strategies, and we need to also have common approaches at the operational level. It's not easy in a region that has a trust deficit. So that's going to be a challenge because there's a lot of distrust. There's a lot of issues between specific countries. Be that as it may, we often talk about common markets, right? Mm-hmm. Removing barriers at the borders, which is amazing. Common markets deliver. We know that. And the Balkans is moving towards that direction. There is no going back. But there is also a thing that we need to understand, that less borders means less checking at the border, because there's not going to be a border. So less border means that goods will flow, funding will flow freely, people will flow freely. But guess what? that in a way is going to be easier for organized crime groups and for violent extremist organizations, terrorist organizations, because there's going to be less checks. So in order to counter this, we need to work closer together to put at the strategic level better strategies. At the operational level, we need to also put together the right instruments to deal with this problem. And this problem, again, let's be very clear in emphasizing, it's not a problem that only Western Balkans deals with in terms of organized crime and terrorism. All other countries in Europe are dealing with exactly the same problem, probably at the higher magnitude, as both panelists mentioned earlier. The problem in the Western Balkans is funding and resources. So there's a convergence of all sorts of transnational threats, but there isn't sufficient funding. There isn't sufficient capacity. And I think you deal with this, and you understand that if there isn't foreign funding coming in, sometimes projects will not be tackled. Sometimes, those strategies will not be put together. And I think it's important to move past this idea that, okay, we have a memorandum of understanding, fine, but practically, what does that mean? Can you operationalize that? Or are you waiting for funding from outside to do it? So there needs to be more focus on this at the government level of each of the countries, so that structures are put in place that are regional in nature, that information is shared in a timely fashion, because these things, they happen quickly. And if there isn't a good understanding of the phenomenon, where they overlap, and if there isn't the right infrastructure in place to share information in timely fashion, then all we can do is write a history book after things have happened. But we're not going to be able to prevent, and preventing is a lot more important than anything else. So what can particularly be done? Because you need to put together approaches. So, as I said, go beyond those modus, go beyond the memorandums of understanding, and put in place, both at the strategic and operational levels, what needs to be there. Identifying funding mechanisms is critical, so one way or another, this has to go through European Union, probably, figuring out a way to fund and set up task forces at the regional level. There needs to be cooperation and coordination protocols that are clear, not ambiguous. There needs to be standard operating procedures that, again, are very clear, because that's the only way to address shared concerns, shared threats. And there has to be a clear understanding of metrics. How are we understanding the threats? How are we understanding the routes that organized crime is using and terrorist organizations are using? So there needs to be a clear and common understanding of metrics and indicators to detect and monitor these threats continuously, not every now and then. So basically, to conclude, it's about monitoring at the same, monitoring all the time, not intermittently, collecting, analyzing, sharing in timely fashion across borders. And as I mentioned, it's important to build trust, because that is going to be the Achilles heel, and that's always been the Achilles heel in the Balkans, in Western Balkans, where we understand the need, we understand the threat, but because we don't trust our neighbor, we don't take that extra step to build the common infrastructure, because we're concerned that they're going to misuse our trust. They're going to misuse the information. They could use, unfortunately I have to say it, even use that information against us. This, the Western Balkans need to do away with. This is not going to be the way of the future. We need to understand that common markets are important, but at the same time, common platforms to tackle common threats are critical at the same time.
common platforms in order to tackle especially security issues like the one that we are discussing. They are very, very important, because what's the point of having the economical collaboration when you don't have this collaboration at the security level, which is a basic level that you need for other levels to progress. So we have around 9 minutes for Q&A. So yes, I'm seeing some hands. We will start there. Please, it can be a question or a remark. It will be good if you could introduce yourself, and also if you have a chosen panelist for your question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the interesting discussion. My name is Jason McCarthy. I work in corporate intelligence investigation sector. My question will be mostly towards Giorgio Fruscione and Ms. Jovana Škorić. What is the role of the private sector in the equation that you're discussing of collaboration in combating against crime, organized crime specifically in the Western Balkan context? Thank you.
Are we going to also collect some other questions? Yes, I see a hand here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mudra Kapoor, and I'm from organization No Immunity from Accountability. I'm curious that nobody mentioned here the Russian influence in Serbia. That's what distinguishes Serbia from all other European countries. If you remove Serbia from this topic, it would be just academic and few tabloid articles. In other words, hooligan groups here are controlled by the government. The president himself is coming from the stadium, from the Red Star race supporters. And we have numerous gongo groups, so government-owned NGOs, that deals with extremism, drug trade, so on and so on. Especially Vojvodina and Novi Sad is full of these groups. They control soccer clubs or football clubs, right? And I haven't seen any connection here, haven't heard, between Putin's Russia and Vučić's Serbia, which is the intricate part of this problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. Do we have somebody else? Okay, Giorgio, we can start with the first question.
You want to go first?
Yes,
Jovana?
and then Jovana
Okay.
as well. Like both
When
of
we're
you.
talking about private sector, they have different kind of research that can help to non-governmental organization. And the problem, social issue, when we're talking about hooliganism or some abuse or exploitation, especially that can be seen when we're talking about digital violence or something like that. The internet provider can make some efforts to do something, to take responsibility to doing some kind of activity, maybe reporting or something like that. And I think that we avoiding to make some connection with private sector, but I think on the end the private sector is equal responsible for different kind of social issue as the public sector, as the government sector as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would like also to add that concerning the private sector, we have been witnessing a relationship that is a kind of triangle. So extremist group, organized crime, and a private sector. So the dynamic is quite the same with the penetration of state institution, and most of the times the objective, the final goal is the same as in the case of penetration of state institutions, so to control and to have more power in the public space. So the dynamic is quite the same, and the fact is that in some cases in the Balkans, private sector is not real private, but is controlled by the same informal structures. So, so the dynamic is quite similar.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Giorgio. In fact, let's go to the next question, which is about the Russian influence in Serbia. So this is a big topic, but in terms of hooliganism. In fact, we are privileged here to have both Ruggero and my colleague Sasha Georgievich, that is in the first row in here, that they together have a report about hooliganism, football hooliganism in this region. Ruggero, also making up on the question that we just heard, what you can say about...
Well, I can definitely start by saying that I totally agree with you. absolutely, is not that, so the context, it's important to contextualize also the way we discussed hooliganism in this specific panel. We can't talk about everything, of course, but I also understand that this is so important that it can't be left out. Totally understood and agreed. In that specific case, I would say that in the specific case of Russian influence, I would even argue that it goes even beyond hooliganism. We came across a number of far-right extremist groups, not only in the realm of football hooliganism, but also which have nothing to do with the football scene. And not only that, this applies not only to Serbia, but also to neighboring countries, as far as, for example, Bosnia is concerned, when it comes to Republika Srpska and the role of a number of groups that work as a proxy for Dodik's government and so on. So I feel you, I totally understand your point. But again, the reason why we haven't addressed this specific case here is because we're talking about the comparisons with other regions and so on. And by the way, I even mentioned Russia in my example, not by coincidence, because there are definitely a lot of similarities, not only in terms of ideology, but also in the way of in modus operandi. In a way, if you compare the groups in Serbia and the groups in Moscow, for example, they have exactly the same settings, exactly the same way of thinking, of operating, of resources that are put in, that are shared, and. But yeah, so absolutely yes. I don't know if Giorgio wants to add anything, or actually even Sasha. And by the way, before I conclude, the point about that report in 2022, and I really suggest you to have a look because I'm sure you're going to find it interesting. We published this report called "Dangerous Games: Football Hooliganism in the Western Balkans," which is a regional assessment of how football hooligans interact with organized crime groups and the way they interact. And yeah, so you're definitely going to find also a few answers in there, other than the report, which is upcoming, of course.
Giorgio, do you want to add something on this?
I think Ruggero said everything.
Ruggero covered that.
I also agree with you with everything, but it was not our intention to omit this topic.
Yeah. Shtuni, what do you think about the presence and the influence of Russia, if you want to take this question as well?
Sure. I mean, there's no debate that Russia has a lot of influence in particular areas in Western Balkans, and they try to grow that influence actively. Primarily, it is in Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Montenegro, and some of it in Northern Macedonia. Less of it in Albania and Kosovo for historic reasons, religious reasons, and other reasons. So yeah, it is a concern that definitely needs to be taken very seriously and studied thoroughly. I'm not sure to what extent that could be reflected in policies, because policies then depend on the government, and the government has particular priorities. If we see the nexus, and if we see how the relations between the current government and Putin's government it's going to be tough to tackle through policies the problem. So I don't know to what extent that can be tackled at this point, but it's important to be aware of the problem. And hopefully there's going to be ways to curb the influence, because it's a disruptive influence, not only for Serbia, Bosnia, and so on, but for the entire region, in my view.
Thank you very much. We are right in time to wrap up this panel. Thank you, dear panelists. Thank you for your attention. We hope that we were able to shed some light in this intersection, which is not always easy. But what we know for sure is the fact that these issues are very critical for the security of this region. So it's important, as it was mentioned here several of times, not only to present the current situation, but also to be able to monitor this phenomena over the time. Thank you very much, and I look forward to discussing the topic further with you in the near future.